It was a quiet evening in a small village nestled at the edge of a dense jungle. The air was thick with the hum of crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. Families had retreated into their homes, their lanterns casting warm glows against the mud walls. But just as the village was settling down for the night, an unusual sound broke through the stillness. A high-pitched cry, faint but unmistakable. The sound stirred curiosity and concern among the villagers. One by one, doors creaked open and people stepped outside with lanterns and flashlights, their brows furrowed as they scanned the darkness. "What is that?" a young man whispered to his neighbor, gripping the handle of a makeshift torch. The cries came again, louder this time, echoing from the direction of the jungle's edge. It was an eerie, desperate sound, one that sent a chill down the spine of those who heard it. A group of villagers cautiously approached the source, their footsteps muffled on the damp earth. They knew the jungle could be unpredictable, and any strange sound could signal danger. As they neared the tree line, the light from their lanterns caught a small, trembling figure. It was a leopard cub, barely a few weeks old, its spotted coat dirty and its tiny body soaked from the evening dew. The cub was crouched near a bush, its wide, frightened eyes reflecting the lantern light. It let out another pitiful cry, its voice raw with exhaustion and fear. The villagers froze, their initial shock giving way to hushed murmurs. "It's a leopard cub," one of the men said in disbelief. "Where's the mother?" another asked, scanning the dark jungle nervously. The absence of an adult leopard made the situation both puzzling and alarming. The cub looked up at the group, too weak to run, its cries growing softer, as if pleading for help. The villagers were faced with a dilemma. This was no ordinary stray. It was a wild animal, and its presence meant its mother might not be far away. Yet seeing the cub's vulnerable state tugged at their hearts. In that moment, the quiet village became the stage for an extraordinary decision, one that would test their compassion, courage, and respect for the wild. Little did they know, the night's events would leave a lasting impact on both the village and the jungle. Earlier that day, deep within the dense jungle, the leopard cub had been nestled safely beside its mother and siblings. The canopy of trees provided shade, and the family had been moving cautiously through their territory. But the peace of the moment was shattered when another predator, a larger male leopard, approached. The mother leopard acted instinctively, shielding her cubs and leading them away. In the chaos, the smallest of the cubs became separated from the group, left behind in the underbrush. Alone and confused, the cub let out high-pitched cries, calling for its mother. The jungle, which had once been a safe haven, now seemed vast and terrifying. Each step the cub took was a struggle. Its tiny legs stumbled over roots and rocks, and the shadows of the dense trees seemed to close in around it. The distant roars of other animals filled the air, a constant reminder of the dangers lurking nearby. Hunger gnawed at the cub's belly, and its cries grew more desperate as the day wore on. The thick jungle was unforgiving, offering no clear path to safety. At one point, the cub stumbled into a patch of thorns, its delicate paws scratched and bleeding as it tried to free itself. With every passing hour, its energy waned, and its cries became weaker. The cub eventually wandered closer to the edge of the jungle, its instincts guiding it toward the faint sounds of human voices in the distance. It didn't understand what the voices meant, but the noise was better than the eerie silence of the jungle. Exhausted and trembling, the cub collapsed near a bush at the outskirts of the village, its small body barely visible among the leaves. As night fell and the rain began to drizzle, the cub cried out again, hoping against hope that its mother might hear. But instead of its mother's comforting presence, the cub's cries reached the ears of the villagers. Frightened yet too weak to move, the cub huddled in place, waiting for something, anything to happen. By the time the villagers found it, the cub was on the brink of collapse. Its ribs were visible under its thin coat of spotted fur, and its breathing was shallow. The tiny leopard looked up at the approaching lights with wide, teary eyes, unsure whether to feel hope or fear. Its struggle for survival had brought it to the edge of the jungle and into the hands of a group of humans who would soon face a choice that could change its life forever. The leopard cub lay on the ground, its tiny frame trembling as it let out faint cries. The villagers stood in a semicircle, their lanterns casting flickering light across the scene. Murmurs rippled through the group as they took in the fragile creature before them. It was rare to see a leopard this close, let alone a cub, and the air was thick with both awe and apprehension. One of the older men, a farmer named Ramesh, broke the silence. "This is no ordinary animal," he said, his voice low and serious. "If the mother is nearby, she'll come looking for it. And if she sees us with her cub—" He trailed off, glancing toward the dark jungle, where shadows shifted with every gust of wind. A younger man, Deepak, shook his head. "But look at it. It won't survive the night like this. It's starving, weak, and soaked from the rain. Can we really just leave it here?" The crowd grew restless, divided between fear and compassion. Some argued that interfering with a wild animal was dangerous, not just for the cub but for the entire village. "The mother might attack the village if she thinks we've taken her cub," one woman said, clutching her shawl tightly. "And what if other predators come, drawn by its cries?" Others, particularly the younger villagers, felt a deep urge to help. "It's just a baby," said Priya, a schoolteacher who had stepped forward. "It didn't ask to be left alone. We can't turn our backs on it." Her gaze shifted to the cub, whose cries were growing weaker by the minute. The village elder, an experienced man named Kiran, raised his hand to quiet the group. "Enough," he said firmly. "We must decide carefully. This is not just about the cub. It's about the safety of the village and our respect for the jungle. If we bring it into the village, we must be prepared for what comes next." Kiran stepped closer to the cub, kneeling to get a better look. The animal was clearly in distress. Its ribs were visible, its tiny paws scratched, and its eyes were wide with fear. "This cub is on the edge of life," he said, turning to the group. "If we leave it here, it will not survive. But if we take it in, we must act responsibly. This is a wild creature, and its mother will not forgive us if we harm it." After a long pause, Kiran made the decision. "We will take the cub to the edge of the village and care for it there. We'll give it food, warmth, and safety until morning. Then we'll see if its mother comes for it. If not, we will contact the forest department to handle this properly." The villagers nodded in agreement, though some remained uneasy. With Kiran's guidance, a few brave men approached the cub with blankets. The animal flinched at first, letting out a small growl, but it was too weak to resist. Carefully, they wrapped it in a soft cloth and carried it to a sheltered spot near the village's edge. The villagers dispersed for the night, leaving only a small group to keep watch. They sat in silence, their eyes scanning the dark jungle for any sign of the mother leopard. The cub, now wrapped in warmth and fed a few drops of goat milk, curled into the blanket and let out a soft, contented sound. As the villagers kept vigil, they couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and hope. They had chosen to save the cub, but the jungle's response was still uncertain. Would the mother come for her baby, or would the village face the consequences of interfering with the wild? Only the dawn would reveal the answer. The villagers gathered at the edge of the jungle, the leopard cub cradled carefully in a blanket by one of the younger men, Deepak. The cub's cries had grown softer, its tiny body weak but still trembling. It was clear the cub needed immediate care if it was going to survive the night. The question now was how to help it without provoking danger. Kiran, the elder, took charge of the situation. "We need to act quickly," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "The cub is too young to survive on its own, and we can't leave it out here for predators to find. Let's take it to a safe spot at the edge of the village where we can care for it and keep watch for its mother." A small group of villagers volunteered to help, bringing blankets, a clay pot of warm goat milk, and lanterns to light their way. They chose a sheltered spot near a large banyan tree where the cub would be protected from the cold night air, but still close enough to the jungle for the mother leopard to find it. As they set up the enclosure, the cub let out a faint growl, its instinctive fear of humans still present despite its exhaustion. "Careful," Priya whispered as she knelt beside it, her hands steady but gentle. She dipped a piece of cloth into the warm milk and carefully brought it to the cub's mouth. At first, the cub flinched, its tiny paws swiping weakly, but the smell of the milk drew it in. It began to lick the soaked cloth hesitantly, then more eagerly as hunger overcame its fear. The villagers watched in quiet relief as the cub drank. Its trembling subsided slightly, and for the first time it seemed to relax, its head resting on the edge of the blanket. "That's a good sign," said Ramesh, the farmer, who had been skeptical at first. "It's gaining strength." But even as the cub showed signs of recovery, the villagers knew they couldn't let their guard down. Kiran assigned a group of 3 men to keep watch through the night, armed with torches and sticks. "If the mother is nearby, she'll be drawn by the cub's cries," he warned. "We need to be prepared, whether she comes in peace or sees us as a threat." The men took their positions near the enclosure, scanning the jungle's edge for movement. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves muted in the aftermath of the storm. Every shadow seemed to shift, every rustle in the underbrush setting their nerves on edge. Meanwhile, Emily and Priya stayed close to the cub, taking turns feeding it small drops of milk and wiping its fur with a damp cloth to clean away the mud and scratches. The cub began to respond to their care, its tiny paws stretching as it shifted to find a more comfortable position in the blanket. "It's just a baby," Emily said softly, her voice tinged with both wonder and sadness. "It doesn't understand what's happening. It just wants its mother." Priya nodded, her eyes fixed on the jungle. "Let's hope she comes for it," she replied. "It's the only chance it has to survive in the wild." As the night wore on, the villagers settled into a tense rhythm of care and vigilance. The cub, now calmer and stronger, let out occasional cries that echoed into the jungle, a fragile beacon of hope for its mother to follow. For the villagers, those cries were both comforting and nerve-wracking, a sign that the cub was still fighting, but also a reminder that danger could be just beyond the trees. By the time midnight arrived, the cub had fallen asleep, its breathing steady as it nestled into the blanket. The villagers kept their lanterns lit and their eyes sharp, knowing the true test of their efforts would come with the dawn. Would the mother return to claim her cub, or would the jungle remain silent? Only time would tell if their decision to intervene had saved a life or invited danger. As the villagers cared for the cub through the night, they couldn't ignore the possibility that its mother might be searching for it. Kiran, the elder, gathered the group and spoke with quiet authority. "If the mother is out there, she will hear the cub's cries," he said, his voice steady. "But we must be careful. A mother leopard, especially one that has been separated from her young, can be unpredictable." The villagers nodded, their expressions a mixture of determination and worry. They decided to create a safe and controlled environment for the cub to increase the chances of a reunion while protecting themselves. The first step was to move the cub to an open clearing near the edge of the jungle, away from the center of the village. This spot would allow the mother to approach without feeling threatened by the presence of humans. Ramesh, the farmer, helped set up a simple enclosure using bamboo poles and cloth. The enclosure was large enough to keep the cub safe from wandering off, but open enough for the mother leopard to see and hear her cub clearly. The group worked quickly but quietly, using lanterns to light the area. "We'll place the cub here," Kiran instructed, pointing to a spot near the middle of the enclosure. "Let it cry naturally. If the mother is nearby, she will hear it. But we must stay hidden and avoid making noise. She won't come if she senses danger." Emily and Priya carried the cub carefully to the enclosure, wrapped snugly in its blanket. The little leopard stirred, letting out soft cries that echoed through the still night. It looked around, its wide eyes reflecting the lantern light, as though sensing something was about to happen. To keep everyone safe, Kiran assigned a group of men to stand watch at a distance. Armed with torches and sticks, they positioned themselves behind trees and bushes, far enough to avoid intimidating the mother leopard, but close enough to intervene if necessary. As the cub's cries grew louder, the villagers retreated to their hiding spots. The once bustling scene grew quiet, with only the sound of the cub's plaintive calls breaking the silence. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shift in the shadows drew their attention. The anticipation was palpable. "Do you think she'll come?" Emily whispered to her father, who stood nearby. Jack nodded, his eyes fixed on the jungle. "If she's alive and close enough, she will. A mother leopard doesn't abandon her young unless she has no choice." The minutes stretched into an hour, the tension growing with each passing moment. The villagers knew the risks. If the mother leopard arrived and felt threatened, she could attack. But they also knew this was the cub's best chance of survival. Just as some began to lose hope, a low growl echoed from the depths of the jungle. The villagers froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the sound. A shadow moved between the trees, growing larger as it approached. The mother leopard had arrived. Now, everything depended on the next few moments. Would the mother recognize her cub's cries and take it back? Or would she see the humans as a threat, putting everyone at risk? The villagers held their breath, knowing they had done everything they could to prepare for this critical moment. The soft growl echoed through the clearing, sending a ripple of anticipation through the villagers hiding behind the trees. Lanterns were dimmed, and the forest grew eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. All eyes were fixed on the dark tree line where the shadow of the mother leopard emerged. Her sleek, powerful frame moved cautiously, her golden eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight as she sniffed the air, alert to any signs of danger. The cub, sensing her presence, let out a loud, desperate cry. It pushed against the edges of the blanket in the enclosure, trying to stand on its shaky legs. The mother paused, her ears twitching toward the sound. Another low growl came from her throat, this time softer, almost like an acknowledgement. "She's here," whispered Emily, her voice barely audible, tears forming in her eyes. She gripped her father's arm tightly as they watched from their hiding spot. The mother leopard crept closer, her every step deliberate and cautious. She stopped just outside the enclosure, her body tense, scanning the area for any threats. The villagers remained perfectly still, their hearts pounding as they watched this incredible moment unfold. The cub cried out again, louder this time, and the mother's composure shifted. Her head tilted slightly and her eyes softened as she stepped into the enclosure. The cub wobbled forward on unsteady legs, letting out high-pitched cries that filled the clearing. The mother crouched low, sniffing her baby, and then gently nuzzled it with her nose. The cub responded immediately, pressing its small body into her chest. The mother wrapped a protective paw around her baby, pulling it closer as she licked its fur in slow, deliberate strokes. The sight was enough to bring tears to the eyes of the villagers watching from a distance. Emily couldn't contain her emotions as she whispered, "She's taking it back." Her voice trembled, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over her. For days, the cub had been in their care, and now it was finally where it belonged. The mother leopard stood, her cub still nestled against her chest, and turned to face the jungle. She glanced back at the enclosure, her eyes briefly scanning the shadows as if to acknowledge the humans who had helped. Then, without hesitation, she carried the cub into the darkness of the forest, her powerful frame disappearing into the shadows. For a long moment, the villagers stayed silent, overwhelmed by the beauty and raw emotion of what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just a reunion, it was a testament to the bond between a mother and her child and the delicate balance between humanity and the wild. Kieran, the elder, finally broke the silence, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We did the right thing," he said quietly. "We gave it a chance to live, and now it's back where it belongs." As the villagers slowly returned to their homes, Emily lingered for a moment, staring into the forest where the leopards had vanished. "Goodbye, little one," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Stay safe." The reunion was complete, but its impact would stay with them forever. A story of compassion, courage, and the unbreakable bond of family, even in the wild. As the sun rose, the village slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm. The memory of the leopard cub and its reunion with its mother lingered in the minds of the villagers. They had come together in a moment of crisis, united by their compassion and their respect for nature. The elder Kieran stood at the edge of the jungle, his eyes fixed on the trees where the mother leopard had disappeared with her cub. "We did what we could," Kieran said softly, his voice carrying a weight of both pride and sadness. "We helped the cub survive, but nature must take its course now." He turned to face the small group of villagers who had remained with him. "The jungle gave us a chance, and we did not turn away from it." Emily, who had watched the reunion unfold with tears in her eyes, nodded in agreement. "It wasn't just about saving the cub," she said, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. "It was about doing what was right, even when we weren't sure what would happen next. Jack, standing beside her, placed a hand on her shoulder. Sometimes the hardest thing is letting go. But the cub is where it belongs now. It's not just a story of survival. It's about the bond between all living things. We made sure that bond could continue. The village slowly began to return to its everyday activities, but the lesson of the leopard cub stayed with them. It was a reminder that the wild, though unpredictable and dangerous, was also a place of incredible beauty and complexity. And that even in the face of uncertainty, kindness and respect for nature could create the most meaningful changes. As the day went on, Emily took one last look toward the edge of the jungle, where the trees whispered in the breeze. She thought about the cub, small, fragile, and alone, and how, in that brief moment of connection, she had witnessed something greater than herself. The jungle was wild, and life was uncertain, but she now understood that every act of kindness, no matter how small, rippled through the world in ways they could never fully see. The villagers had done their part. The rest was up to the jungle and the creatures within it. The story of the cub would live on in their hearts, a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't always guarantee a perfect ending, but it always makes a difference.